The Panasonic GH5 versus the Canon R5. My old reliable workhorse versus a shiny new toy. What do you think's gonna happen when you put them head to head? Okay, so here are the two cameras of my life right now. I have the old school GH5, which I've done on hundreds of shoots. I love this camera. It has been a reliable workhorse for me for the 4 years that I've had it. And now I've got the new Canon R5. And I know in some ways, guys, you're saying, why are you comparing a 4-year-old camera, Bryan, to the brand new Canon R5? And, well, the main reason for that is just that this is still a great camera. And I think there are a lot of you out there that still have GH5s in your arsenal. And the question that I came as I started migrating more to video work with this R5 was, could I still use this GH5 as a reliable backup B cam with the R5? I think that's a legitimate question because I don't need to go out and buy 2 bodies of this or an A7S III, which I still might do eventually. I want to know, do I have a great backup right here? And to know that, I had to see how it compares to the R5. What I tested in this test was pretty simple. I wanted to test the GH5 4K 10-bit versus the Canon R5 4K HQ and the standard 4K to see how those two go up. And I felt I needed to do that because sometimes the 4K HQ on the Canon R5 can overheat, and I wanted to know if my 4K HQ overheats, should I go to standard on the R5 or maybe should I jump over to the GH5? So I wanted to see how all 3 of these played out. So that was the first thing I did. Rule number 1, I did not try and match the cameras on these tests. I wanted to see basically how the cameras matched up. I just put a basic LED on both of these, so that's rule number 1. And I wanted to test 3 things here. I wanted to test normal lighting conditions, basically outside. I wanted to test low light conditions in a studio, and I wanted to do some slow motion comparisons. And one thing to note too, guys, is that these are completely non-scientific tests. These are subjective, and I don't mind doing subjective tests sometimes because we do a subjective medium, right? I mean, I know I've never been on a set where I actually had to show a client actual, color charts and stuff like that. It's always been the subjective feel of the camera. So that's a big part of what this test will be. The other thing that I want to make sure you know is I did not test autofocus. It's not even close. I think anybody who's ever worked with Panasonic and Canon know that, but there will be no autofocus comparisons because that's just cruel, man. So let's go ahead, let's jump in the computer and see what we got. So I basically start off here with the GH5, and one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to get a lot of background information, and I really wanted a situation where the sky really pushed the full dynamic range of the cameras. And I really feel like where you see this the best is here when I compare them all side by side. Now, if you look here, you can really start to see some of the differences between the various formats. Really, the first thing that you'll notice is if you look up here in the top of the sky, you'll start to see that the R5 does preserve just a little bit more detail up here in the highlights. And I'll come up here and you can really see it if you look between the two of them here in these little limbs and these leaves here that are on the details of the trees. You can also see if you look between this gap in the tree right here and right here, the GH5 does clip out a little bit faster than the R5. It looks like the R5 just preserves a little more detail. Now that being said, if you come down, you can also really see how they handle the skin tones a little different. I'll probably try and see if I can find one here. And, I find that just kind of out of the box, the Canon R5 tends to be a little more contrasty than the GH5. I think a big part of that has to do with the log settings, and I'll show you that in a second. But you can really see these differences here in the level of contrast. Look under the brim of my hat here between the two of them. You can see there's a little bit more detail preserved in the GH5 just because it's not as contrasty. The V-log is not as contrasty as the C-log image. And then I really think the other thing that I found really interesting in this test, if I go to 200%, is if you look here at the word crew on my shirt, you can really see the difference between the 4K HQ and the standard 4K on the GH5. I'm going to pop to 400% just to see it. And this is really where you see a lot of those tests online where people show you text and stuff. And if you look here, you can see how crisp that is on the HQ, but it does get noticeably softer on the standard 4K. You can also see the contrast is a little less there on the standard 4K. And the picture face, you can see the stubble just a little more defined there between the two of them. When you come over to the GH5, you can see here that it's not as sharp as the 4K HQ, but it is noticeably sharper than the 4K standard. You know, I thought this was a really good first starting test, because what this does is this allows you to really see some of these differences. And as you can see, the GH5, in my opinion, still makes a really beautiful, pretty image. Okay, so now what I'll do is I want to jump over and show you a comparison of a close-up test here that I did here between the two cameras, just so you can really focus on skin tones. And here's a good example of seeing where, you know, in my past experience, the Panasonic, the Vlog, anytime you shoot in Vlog, it tends to have a bit of a green shift in the tones. And I think you can kind of see that here, whereas you have more of a red tone magenta shift here in the Canon cameras. And I really think when you play these things side by side, you know, you can really see the skin tone differences. I don't think either one of these is better or worse. I think there's a tonal difference. I also think they can be easily matched better, but you can see those differences there. And, you know, once again, I'll point out, if you look here, especially under the brim of my hat, you'll notice that the Canon R5 is just more contrasty right off the bat. And you'll also can notice here in this highlight section, I still have highlight detail preserved, but you do notice there's just a little bit of a smoother roll off here between the Canon R5 and the GH5. And I'll pull up those roll offs here just so you can see them. There's just a little bit of a smoother roll off. And then once again, comparing the HQ versus the standard, it's just a little bit sharper there. You can really see it here in the hairs of my arm. This is a little sharper. The other thing here that I'd like to point out too is the difference between the log versions of these files, which in my opinion, Vlog is a much, much better log than C-Log 1, I guess, which is what you have on the Canon R5. And I'm just going to show you the difference here. If you look at Vlog, you can see how much flatter that is. There's just a lot more to play with there in a Vlog setting. Whereas if I come over here to my Canon log setting, I can click that on and off. And you can see it's a much weaker log. I mean, there's not really much to that. And if I compare that to, you know, these two images, you can just see the night and day difference between the power of the log image. So I feel like Vlog just gives me a little more room to work with in general, but hopefully there'll be a firmware update that gets us C-Log 2 and C-Log 3 on the Canon R5. That is the rumor. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to jump over to what I consider another very important part of this test. I really think, you know, when you really want to see what a camera truly is, I really feel studio lighting is where you want to get that ultimate control. And that's really where I want to see how a camera performs and to make sure that these two cameras can exist side by side. I find myself on smaller productions, which most of you shooting with R5s or Canon GH5 will be on smaller productions. A lot of times you have to make sacrifices for lights and not have quite as much powerful lights as you want, or you don't have all the equipment that you need. So for me, a low light functionality of a camera is an absolute critical thing. And as you can see here on my Panasonic GH5, you can see the autofocus struggling there, as the Panasonic autofocus knows to do. But you can see it's still a really nice, clean image. I think the skin tones are really nice. But here you can really see the differences in the color between the Panasonic and the GH5. Once again, the contrast between the images does become apparent right off the bat. You'll also notice once again how that green cast from the classic Vlog does influence the blue on the wall. And I can match this and bring it up if I boost my magenta and do some grading. But this, like I said, I really wanted to show you how the camera just instinctively tries to record so you can see that. But that being said, all three images, I think natively have pretty good skin tones. I still want to adjust the skin tones, but they instinctively get the skin tones. But you do see how that contrast here on the R5 is pretty strong. The other thing I want to point out here is if you look here, and I think this is really an important thing, you can start to see right away the film grain that exists even at 800 ISO in the GH5. And it is definitely there. It's nothing that I think is too distracting, but it's there. It's definitely there. And if you look over here in the R5, it's just not there at all. Even in the standard, it's not there. And if you want to see the standard, that's it. I still think the standard holds up well. It is a little softer. You can really see it here in my stubble. It's just a little less refined. But I think for all practical purposes, it's good to go. Now let's pop on over here to 1600 ISO. And this is really, in my opinion, where the 1600 ISO is where the cameras start to separate. Having shot hundreds of things with the GH5, I really only use 1600 if I have to. And if I zoom in here, you're going to really see a difference in the noise pattern between the R5 and the GH5. You can really start to see that noise and that dancing here. In this situation, this would be one where I would want to begin to start employing some basic noise reduction because I'm starting to find this a little distracting. I can still work with it, but I just don't like it. And then if you look here at the two versions of the Canon R5, it's still really, really clean and really, really nice. So let's keep on jumping on here. Let's go ahead and look at it at 3200. And at 3200, both the Canons, both versions hold up really, really well. But when I look here, you can see just how noisy this comparison is between them. The noise now is getting really, really high here in the GH5. And once again, I still feel like I've got pretty good, really good noise here in the R5. The HQ, I get almost no noise. I have a little bit more fuzziness here in the standard, but I still think it's really, really good. I'd be happy with that. We'll jump over here to 6400. And I think at this point in the game, you just really see the GH5 completely fall apart. You have lots of distracting noise. You're beginning to get just a hair bit of banding in here. And now the skin tones still look good, I think. I mean, they're a little bit more washed out, but I still think the skin tones look good. But if you just compare this to the Canons, and I'll pull this over so we can kind of look in the shadow detail, it's a night and day difference. There's very, very little noise here still in the Canon R5, tons of noise here in the GH5. And even if I pull up just my versions of the R5, the HQ versus the standard, you can still see it's still pretty clean. And I still have pretty good detail here. I mean, look at the stubble on my face. I got really good detail in the HQ. And even here on the standard, it's pretty good. And when I come over here to my GH5, I feel like the highlights still hold up pretty well, but you can just see how distracting that noise is. And then finally what I did is I put it all the way up to 12,800 because I have found myself in the past in certain situations having to use this. It's not ideal, but sometimes you do need it. It's an ISO that you'll come across every now and then, especially if you're shooting outside in the dark. And really, if you look here, the image is just completely destroyed here. I could not give that to someone commercially and feel good about that. But if you look at the R5, both the HQ and the standard, it actually holds up really, really good, doesn't it? And if I come back here, if I pop them in here at 200% so you can see them side by side, You can just really see how nasty. I mean, you've actually got at this point, the GH5, it's really interfering with my image. And really, on my Canon R5, I feel I could work with these images. There is noise here now I would want to put, but I feel like a little noise cleaner in either one of the R5s would really solve the problem. And I could use that. All right, and then for the last test, what I want to do is I wanted to show you just a comparison of the difference between the cameras. Is I have an R5 at 12,800 ISO and a GH5 at a 1600 ISO. And if I play them side by side, you'll see the noise grain on them comes out pretty similar, honestly. I'll pop in just so you can see it at 200%. And you can see here, very similar. Now, I do think that the at this stage, the GH5 is a little more film-like noise. I feel like when you get to 12,800 on the ISO on the R5, it's a little more blotchy, not quite as filmic as 1600 on the GH5, but still. But the good thing is I know that if I'm in a situation where I'm ever in an emergency and I need to use 12,800 ISO, I know I have that option on the R5, even though it's not ideal. Whereas on the Panasonic GH5, I just don't have those options. I really don't like pushing it past 1600 because the noise starts to get really distracting, especially once you start extracting this stuff and putting it on the web, which the compression even emphasizes that noise even more. Okay, so there you go. I found that test to be very enlightening for me, and it goes to prove once again that the GH5 continues to punch above its weight class. It's hard to find a better camera for this price range and this form factor. There's just not a lot of cameras that really can do as much as this can for the price it goes. So I was really surprised when it all comes down to see how many places the GH5 still beats out the Canon R5. All right, so let's talk about real quick where the Panasonic GH5 wins versus the Canon R5. Now, first and foremost, you gotta say it, is reliability. This thing is a tank. It has never let me down on hundreds of shoots. It never overheats. I can pretty much use it in cold, heat, rain, you name it. I've always been able to use it. It's a tank, it's reliable. If you pull it out of the bag, you know it's going to work and you don't have to sweat any blinking overheat warning. So reliability, the GH5 smokes the Canon R5 from a video perspective. Another area that it really wins is log options. V-Log is just a better log than C-Log that's currently on the Canon R5. Now that being said, Canon is supposed to be doing a firmware update where they'll get C-Log 3, maybe C-Log 2 on the Canon R5. In that situation, I think it's going to be a lot closer, but as it stands today, V-Log is just a better log in my opinion, and I like working with it better. So the log options, the GH5 still wins in that component. Now, frame rate options. One thing that I like about the GH5 if I want to do slow motion work is that I can really be flexible. The R5 gives me 60 frames, 120 frames a second. I could switch to PAL and do 50 and 100, I guess. But the GH5 is so much more flexible. If I want to shoot 72 frame rates, I can. If I want to shoot 36, I can. If I want to shoot something like really slow, I can shoot slow frame rates. So this camera, once again, just gives you so much more options in frame rates. And as a guy that likes to play around with frame rates when he's shooting, this camera, the GH5, really does do a much better job on that than the Canon R5. Customization, this is just a better video camera. Panasonic holds nothing back. They literally let you set this up the way you want. I did find the Canon R5 when I was customizing it. You can see my secret video switch video there to see an example of this. It just sort of limited some of the customization you wanted to do, and I found that just a little more frustrating. I think the customization on the GH5 is better than the customization on the R5. Recording options, you have a lot more options here in the GH5. I find it frustrating that if I'm not shooting C-Log or I have to shoot C-Log on the R5 to get 10-bit, that just seems silly to me. You should be able to have that as a separate thing. But, you know, I'm not going to get all into that. There's other great videos out there about the recording options on the R5. But the GH5 Gives you way more flexibility. You can basically, if you want to do 10-bit, you can. If you want to do 8-bit, you can. You can do all kinds of stuff. It doesn't matter if you're shooting in log or not. So definitely the recording options are way better, way more flexible, I should say, on the GH5. Time lapses. Time lapses are another area. You could spend a whole video on that. Maybe I will someday. But the time lapses on the R5 are actually really, really disappointing, especially compared to the Panasonics and the newer Panasonics like the S1s. Man, they have great time lapses. But even the GH5, I love the fact that I could go out there, do a time lapse, and also have a 4K video, but still have access to my 4K raw photos later on if I wanted to make a higher version of that time lapse. You can't do that on the R5, which is weird because it's primarily a photo camera, but hey, go figure. So time lapses, in my opinion, are better on the GH5. And really the last thing is this. I just think this is subjective, but the footage from the GH5 still feels slightly more filmic. It just got the saturation or the contrast a little bit lower, and it just feels a little more film-like to me, whereas the punchier R5 just maybe feels a little more video-y. So that's the thing. Now, that being said, let's be honest, guys, the Canon R5 still has some significant wins in the win column, and they really are critical things depending on how you shoot. And really, the first thing I've got to just come down and say is massively, massively better low light. It's not even close, as you just saw in the test. If you need low lights, and I think every video shooter out there always has to end up shooting in low lights in some situations, it's not even close. The Canon R5 smokes the GH5. The other thing is the autofocus. I mean, this is something that is so important in certain things. I find that when I'm doing interviews and the whatnot like that, just having this autofocus there is such a weight off my shoulders that having a good autofocus system is really important, and the Canon R5 destroys the GH5 in that component. Another area that it wins is it is nice that you can do 4K 120 frames. Now that comes with a big caveat because you're very limited because of the heat, but the GH5 can only do 4K up to 60 frames a second, and it is nice having that option in 4K on the R5 if you can get it not to overheat. So it's nice just having that there. And that really brings me to the other thing, which is 8K. I kind of thought it was a gimmick, but I'll be honest, I have found myself using 8K, not necessarily raw, but just the all-I version of this for certain product stuff and certain commercial things. It's so sharp, it's so crisp, that for some of my commercial clients, having that 8K option, yeah, that's really nice, man. I really like having it. And, you know, the GH5 does max out their 4K option. And really, another thing I think is just awesome that you don't hear enough praise about are the lens mounts on the Canon R5. And it's kind of the whole R line, I think. But Canon did a great job. They switched to these RF mounts, but these EF converters, they have one that has a drop-in built-in ND filter. You can do a variable ND filter. And I love that. That is amazing. Having an ND filter here that close to the sensor, I can put any lens on there. I don't have to be taking off my ND filters. I can put a 14 millimeter, which I've never been able to do and have an ND filter. So the lens mounts for this camera are kicking, man. I love it. It's really, really great. And really, the image is crispier, it's punchier, it's more contrasty, and while that may not necessarily be filmic, it's actually really, really good if you're doing a lot of product or commercial work, because sometimes your clients want their products to have that extra punchy, crispy look. So it's still a great looking image one way or another. You can still make it filmic, but so in some cases, that may be what you want depending on it. So there you go. Interesting, huh? I mean, I still think that the GH5 is a great, great camera. My opinion of it hasn't changed with these newer generation of cameras that came out. As long as you have good lighting and you don't need critical autofocus, this is still a great, great camera that even 4 years later works really, really nice in my opinion with the GH5. I will definitely be keeping this in my bag. I'm not selling it because I think I can just still use it. There's so many great things on there that I think we have from this camera. Now, one thing I didn't talk about in this review, because this review went way longer than I thought, is slow motion options. And if y'all want a video, put me some links down there and I'll be happy to do one. I just didn't want to make this like 40 minutes long because I knew no one would sit through that. So if you want to see the slow-mo test, they are very interesting too. And it's another reason why I love the GH5. So Anyway, guys, I hope that helped. If you have a GH5 and you've been thinking and wondering how they kind of stack up, hope that was helpful for you. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions or comments down below. Anything else you'd like to see, I'd be happy to try and answer your questions. And yeah, go out there, keep on shooting, and rev up these beasts. All right.